There we
Afternoon,
go.
Frank.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
Okay, the world keeps changing and getting more exciting, but this week it's been mainly the Democratic National Convention and other political things going on in England and Europe. And it occurred to me that I've been talking for some time now about the crucial phase of globalization. Um, that the idea that the period we're moving through now is the period of the fastest change in world history. And change is very interesting, but it causes problems for a number of reasons, partly because not everything changes at the same time, but also because change is disruptive. Anyway, I think that because of the rate of change, we're having increasing difficulty with organization because we depend upon institutions. The institutions are developed to fit particular social conditions, and our institutions are getting outdated, and it's very difficult to change institutions.
Hmm.
So then I began to try to work out just exactly what we could um, how we could understand this situation better. And it occurred to me that we have a number of different types of organization, which have always fitted together quite well. And I think probably they're not fitting together so well now as they used to. And what I am thinking of is our political organization, i.e., how we elect a president or a prime minister, um, our bureaucratic organization, which is the machinery that the elected leaders use in order to carry out their duties, and corporations,
Hmm.
which are fictive legal identities, and nobody is quite sure what their relationship should be with people who have real legal identities. So I think that what's been going on over the last century, one could certainly take it back that far, but it's becoming more and more problematic now, is a misfit between these different um, organizational forms.
Hmm.
And especially the easiest way to see it now is to look at Boris Johnson in charge of the British Foreign Office.
Yes, yes.
um,
Well, it's interesting that you raise those three organizations that have had some degree of permanence over the years, and obviously corporations have to be the most responsive because if they don't earn money and don't return money, then they have to make changes or they go out of business. I think the bureaucratic structure, the machinery of government, that's possibly the one that's least susceptible to any sort of influence or any sort of change. Whereas one would think that the political organization, as we've seen, is sort of hercules-jerkily affected by pressures. But when in fact it is affected, it can change very quickly.
but it's at least 100 years since corporations started to interfere with government in order to balance their books.
Well, I think that as long as there have been corporations, I think the people running them have been aware of the necessity to have an appropriate relationship with the people
Yeah.
maintaining the social order.
And of course, it was governments who launched the big corporations in the late medieval period, anyway.
That's right.
But then it was a question of, I mean, so up until the 19th century, the relationship between these three different forms of organization was much closer
Hmm.
than it has become since then. And it's only at the end, in the latter part of the 19th century, that all these big corporations that the state had nothing to do with began to operate on their own and try to create their own environment.
Well, what's just as interesting to me is that there's a sense of divisiveness setting apart each of those three groups. at any time in history, even including today, with the left part of the Democratic Party is very anti-corporation. Usually the Republicans are very anti-government bureaucracy, and the, I suppose, executive or the political organization is always fighting against the bureaucracy, trying to implement things that they feel they've been elected to implement. So it's never in lockstep. They're always seemingly at odds with each other.
Yes, and the corporation is the most flexible of the three.
They answer to fewer people.
They answer to fewer people, and in fact, the way the corporation works has changed enormously in the last 100 years or so. Whereas the rules for running the politics are very difficult to change, and the bureaucratic organization is full of vested interests, which again are very difficult to change.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it seems to me that the corporations are gaining on the other two forms of organization at the moment, and that's part of the what's, I think, going to be very different between the 20th century and the world we're moving into as globalization develops.
Well, so having identified these three seemingly perpetual institutions or organizations, how do they fit within this accelerating globalization, accelerating rate of change?
Well, the governments are finding it more and more difficult to do what they are supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
India is a very interesting example because India has done almost nothing to its infrastructure since the English left, and now it's the corporations in India which are becoming very successful, some of them, even buying up things in the British economy, who are creating the infrastructure that they need in order to manage their own affairs around the part of India in which they operate. Europe seems to do quite well for infrastructure, but when Europeans come here, one of the first things they often say is that who looks after the infrastructure? Why are the bridges falling down? Why are the roads full of potholes?
Mm-hmm.
So just exactly why the European countries should be doing better in this way than America, I don't know. But it presumably has something to do with the political organization.
One would think it has. I can't see it having anything to do with the corporation, and I can't see it having anything to do with the vested interest that exists in the so-called bureaucracy. So it is, in fact, by default, the political organization which doesn't have the will or has different priorities other than infrastructure repair. And certainly in India, as we've talked about in the past, just simply basic food subsistence and personal hygiene kind of things that have been undertaken there, efforts that have been undertaken. Probably infrastructure is ranked near the bottom of priorities, or has been for a long time.
It would be interesting to compare what we know about America and Europe, and to some extent India, with what's going on in China. Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot been written recently about the current head of the Chinese government, Xi, and the fact that he has taken over more responsibility than any of his predecessors. And that, in fact, the society is changing so fast that, and this is based on what I've been reading in The Economist in the last few days, there is a great likelihood that there's going to be more and more resistance to the way the government does things. But in fact, the Chinese government has been very successful so far.
It's interesting you can say that, because in China, for example, that's an instance where one of the three organizations, in this case the political organization, is unified from the top down. I mean, the leader's will be implemented. And I also suspect, although I'm not sure, but from what I've read, is that the middle organization, the bureaucracy, if you will, is certainly much more responsive to the political will in China than, say, it is, for example, in the United States. Because in China, if the bureaucratic administration doesn't do as commanded, there can be very onerous consequences, whereas that doesn't happen in the West. So they may be ahead on that score in being able to implement what the leader or leadership desires to be the things that need to be addressed.
Yeah, and it's China. There's a lot of things about China that are very interesting. For example, the Cultural Revolution in the decade starting in the mid-60s, which got a very bad press at the time, really completely changed Chinese society for the better. That it integrated it into a national society in a way that it had never been before, and made possible so much of what's happened since then.
Do you mean in a reactionary way?
Well, no, it mixed up the whole population.
Yes.
So that, and in the past, China had been for 2,000 years an enormous integrated political unit, but most people in each part of China knew nothing about the rest of China.
So you mean the intelligentsia out mingling with the peasants as they were doing their work duty? I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, what the Cultural Revolution did was it integrated. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I think that it was all good, but some of its effects were extremely useful for what has happened later.
I can see that
because it integrated the national society and made possible all sorts of things that hadn't been possible before. Even though the bureaucracy had to some extent been national before that, since they introduced the examination system in the over 1,000 years ago, some 1,300 years ago. Anyway, China can do things like that, but we can't get rid of vested interests in that way. And so the only way that things are going to change in the what we like to think of as the democratic world is when they fade away, because they lose the ability to do anything. And that means that corporations are probably going to become more and more powerful in the coming years.
I agree with that. But so let me ask you, I don't know if you saw President Obama's speech last night.
I didn't hear it all, but I know some of it.
All right. Well, Obama essentially picked up just where we're leaving off, saying that democracy is very flawed, it's very difficult, change under democracy is frustratingly slow, but the alternative is essentially being ruled. And democracy is still of the people, by the people, and for the people, in all of its imperfections, presumably referring to the political organization of the three that we just reviewed at the onset.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a very telling comment, because what we see in Russia and what Trump is espousing, it's a more singular kind of direction, a singular rule kind of theory, whereas Obama made it very plain that, I mean, in fact, he even said the words, if that's what you're interested in, he said, vote for him. But if you still believe in the idea of democracy, however imperfect it may be, in this 21st century, then you don't have a choice. And I thought that was a fairly stark contrast, because we always talk about the imperfections of the governmental institutions, about democracy in the West and in the United States, rightly so. But then the question is, at any particular point in time, what is the alternative? Is the alternative going in the direction of a ruled kind of society, or is the alternative a more expansive kind of democracy? And it just was a very interesting juxtaposition of events.
It's going to be very interesting to see what sort of comments he gets on that in the next few weeks, and to what extent it gets repeated. Because what's happened in the last few months with the rise of Trump and the support for Corbyn in England is that people who are not intellectual in the way that Obama is are expressing their opinions and thinking they have a right to express their opinions in ways that they've never done before. And I suspect that they would not be happy with what Obama is saying.
Oh, no.
This is the problem with the way things are changing. That it's becoming more and more difficult to organize things in the longer term, and populism, therefore, is rising as a problem that we need some sort of solution for.
Well, that's interesting. In this era, to be able to appropriately, I agree with you, refer to populism as a problem. But it's true.
But it's going to be interesting to see how, what you can do with populism is going to depend so much on what you can do with the economy and with jobs and education. And those are things that, of course, the politicians are talking about all the time. There has been serious problems with economic problems over the past decade, which have provided the basis for populism now. And there's a lot of talk now about making education more freely available for everybody.
Yes.
That may change the role that populism could play in the future.
Well, Brian, thank you very much. We'll look forward to seeing where we are during our next broadcast.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye for now.
Bye.